Good afternoon and welcome to Jeff and the Rabbi. Coming up to Purim here, very exciting. Some last night, obviously we're going to do a Purim show here, and last night I was thinking about it a little bit. The thing about the whole Purim story is, it starts off with this wild, or as the kids say today, epic party. Epic. So I don't know how believable this whole situation. It has a party so big that we got kings' wives getting naked here. We've got beauty pageants.
180 days.
180 days, and I've been to some parties.
You've been to some parties.
Never been to parties that long. So I'm thinking, a party like this. Listen, this is ancient Iran. This is one of those check your burqa at the door type parties, if you know what I mean. Things are going pretty wild. And I think, is that the most believable way to tell the story? So I'm trying to compare it to my life today. You and I have talked about this. Every once in a while, a couple times a year, I go out to Hollywood. Told you about that. Great club out there. A friend of mine owns. It's really fun. Wild things goes on there. They even have, you order a certain drink, a midget. Wait, are we allowed to say midget? Can we still say midget, or is it vertically challenged individual, dressed as an Oompa Loompa, flies over, hooked up to wires, over the entire club, brings you drinks. Wild stuff going on. There's vertically challenged people. There's horizontally challenged people. It's an amazing, wild thing. It's a great story. Now, so I'm thinking, when they eventually write the book of Jeff, which I'm assuming they will, it's probably not going to be that profound. It might not be on the shelf next to the book of Esther. Should they start with this? Are the people 2,000 years from now going to understand, the midget flying, and you think midgets are still flying over parties? Should we probably start with something a little bit more believable? Now, luckily we have Facebook, so there's pictures. But I'm thinking it might be probably not the most believable thing. You got this great story of Purim, but did it really happen? Did this wild party, 180-day party really happen?
So could you imagine if years from now, we all know about the book of Jeff,
right?
And some people take it, it's kind of like a legend or something like that. And lo and behold, they're doing this archaeological excavation, and they come up with this place, and they found all kinds of bottles of liquor and glasses.
Midget fossils.
Little midget bones. Right. And we're unbelievable.
It's really true. That's what you need.
It's really true.
That's a good point.
Right.
Do we have any of that for the Purim story?
So it just so happens. The whole Purim story takes place in one place, pretty much. They keep sending out runners over the whole empire, but the whole story takes place in the palace.
Right.
It just so happens that they have excavated a palace in Iran.
Wow, okay.
Okay? And this palace, they first started excavating it in the 1850s, and there have been many, many, many subsequent excavations, and almost all historians concur that this is the palace where the whole Purim story took place.
Is it in Shushan or wherever Shushan is?
It's called Shusha. Shusha in Persian.
Right.
Okay,
Pretty close.
Pretty darn close. In English it's called Susa, it's called Shusha. And aside from the fact that they have this palace that's called by this name, aside from the fact that the locals have a tradition that this was the place, aside from that, when you analyze the palace, you see amazing things. So many things that just ring true. It's literally like finding midget bones next to drinking cups.
Wow. Okay.
It's
that's
really,
pretty
really
big.
amazing. Really amazing. Now, of course it's a pity when it comes down to bones that in ancient history, whenever there were tombs and palaces and stuff like that, they usually got conquered by someone, and when whoever conquered them, they usually made a mess of the place.
Right.
And usually they looted all the good stuff, but they still have found an amazing number of things. And luckily enough, there's a guy named Yehuda Landy. And Yehuda Landy...
Jewish fellow?
Jewish guy.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guessed.
Jewish fellow. Knew him actually personally many, many years ago. Big Denver Broncos fan. So all you Denver Broncos fans, Yehuda Landy's on your side. So the palace at Shushan has been excavated extensively, and many, many artifacts are in museums all around the world. Yehuda Landy has went to work, collected all this information, put it together, and just wrote a book, published a book, and he shows how so many things in this palace parallel exact details of the story that we all know and we read on Purim. And he's
Right.
published this book, and we've got some pictures
Wow.
from the book. So I'm ready to take you on a little bit of a tour.
Okay.
Just a little bit of a tour. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but I hope when you're done, you'll probably all run out and buy Yehuda Landy's book, Feldheim Publishers. I'm going to give him a plug. This way maybe he won't sue me or something for
Good thinking.
using the picture, right?
It's good thinking.
I think we'll cover ourselves there.
Right.
But anyway, yeah. So the first picture that we're going to start off with is actually a picture, an aerial view of the entire palace. And it was pretty big. And pretty big. I mean, I could give you the
Wow.
dimensions of it and all that, but the place was gigantic. And it's there just outside of, not too far from the city of Shiraz in Iran today.
All right.
Okay? Now, the interesting thing about this palace, as they looked around, is that it says in the beginning of the story, and I'm going to read you from the story. So we've got this great, huge palace, and I also happen to have the story right in front of me. So it says, it happened in the days of Achashverosh, and he is Achashverosh, who was ruling over 127 states from Hodu to Kush. That's all the way from India to Ethiopia.
Oh, it's
And
nice
by the
size
way,
area. Yeah.
that's the bottom. In the north, it went from northern India all the way across to Greece.
Big empire.
Big empire.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big empire. 127 states it was made up of then. Okay? So at the time when Achashverosh ruled over his kingdom, whose seat was in Shushan, the capital, in the third year of his reign, he made a banquet for all his ministers and servants. So this capital and this palace is very, very interesting. It has a lot of significance to the story. Because before this palace, the palace was located in the Babylonian Empire in the city of Babylon.
It's over in Iraq then.
That's in Iraq.
Right.
What happened was the Persians conquered Iraq.
Right.
And they set up shop in the Persian capital of Babylon, and the Iraqi or Babylonian capital of Babylon. Now comes Achashverosh and probably Darius, and they wanted to get out of Babylon.
Right.
So they moved over to this place, Shushan, and they built a palace over here. Now, here's an interesting thing. One of the things that they wanted to do was they wanted to show that they're not Babylonian.
Right.
They're not Babylonian. So, now we read on in the story just a little bit. He does this party, which you mentioned.
Yep.
It's a 180-day long party for all the ministers. And then he made another 7-day party. And it describes this courtyard, garden, and orchard of the king. Well, it's hard to see in this picture, and I couldn't put in too many pictures,
Here.
but we got it identified still in that same picture there. Okay, now that area, if you go up and you see a bunch of like white dots, that's called the Apadna.
That way.
Okay, the Apadna.
Yep.
Okay, it's near the top, a bunch of white dots. Those were columns. Those were columns. They held up a gigantic ceiling. This was a
Interesting,
huge, open. This was the palace where he did all of the entertaining and all that. If you come down to the bottom of the picture, that lower part of the picture was the palace where the family was, and the women's palace. We're going to talk more about that in just a minute, and that's where people came to see him and all that. But in the upper part, where they got all the white dots, those are what's left of columns, and they held up. That's where all the big parties and all that, and the area just to the right of it was where he was an outdoor garden, and he had this big party. And in this party, he had white and green and aquamarine embroidery and all this stuff, and fine linen and purple wool and all this type of stuff, because it was great tents that he set up out in this garden. Then he comes along and he says, there's a lot of wine, much wine. Any amount of drink was in order, as there was no compulsion. And he says the vessels, no two vessels were the same.
Okay.
No two vessels were the same. Well, how do you get that? No two vessels are the same. I mean, if you make glasses, how do you make glasses? No two glasses.
Pretty difficult to do that. Yeah.
Hundreds of guests, no two vessels are the same. So they were going through this palace, and there's another palace, which is a parallel palace, at a place called Persepolis, which is Persiaopolis. Okay,
Right.
there's another palace there, And in Persepolis, they found these wine glasses. Well, take a look at this wine glass here. This wine glass is officially called a Rhython, and I think it's this one happens to be located currently in the New York Museum. Now, look at that. They found glasses like this.
That's pretty original.
That is pretty original.
Yeah, it really is.
And you know what? They made no two were the same.
Wow.
Everyone had their own wine glass.
That's pretty good.
So it's neat that in that palace,
Yeah.
where they said that no two glasses
You
were the
find
same,
something like that.
and you find a wine glass like that, and you go, oh, I get it. I can see how no two were the same.
Right.
And they've got some other pictures. He's got in this book. Landy has pictures of others that you see when you look at them. No two are the same.
That's interesting.
Right?
Right.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. And they talked about how they were gold glasses. Now, one of the big deals that he was trying to make was he wanted no two glasses were the same. Achashverosh was trying to promote himself as very non-Babylonian. The Babylonians used to have this custom that they would drink. They had a bowl of wine,
Right.
and you'd drink from it, and you'd make your toast,
right.
and they'd pass it on to the next guy, and he had to drink from it, make his toast,
Wow.
and it went around.
They didn't have hepatitis C back then, I guess.
Right. Aside from, well, maybe they had really strong drinks, so it killed
I was gonna
everything.
say.
So he was trying to show, no, I'm not like Babylonians. Everybody gets their own glass. Just
Right.
kind of neat that we find their own glass.
That's interesting. Very
Okay.
interesting.
Now the next thing you know is it says that there was this queen named Vashti, and she made a party in the women's palace.
Sure.
Now, the women's palace, that's the next one. I have to
That's right.
write that in there. That is the front door. Well, let's go back a little. Let's go back one. We'll see what
This
the women's. That's it. That's the
Yeah.
women. Now, look at that. They've uncovered this thing. And what do you see? All these little rooms.
Right.
Rooms. All these little rooms. There's hundreds of them. Hundreds of these little rooms. And notice each one has a little side room.
Yep.
I might guess this was probably a bathroom or
Right.
something.
Right.
Right? And each one had their own little room. What are you doing in the palace with like all these little rooms?
Point.
Well, and they keep talking about the women's palace, the women's palace. So they dug up the palace, both the one at Persepolis, which has been restored, it's in much better condition, and this one that we see here in Susa, in Shushan, attached right behind the king's quarters is this women's palace.
That makes sense.
With all these
yeah.
little rooms.
Yeah.
Right? And he had them there. And he had two kinds. There were two groups described in the Megillah. There were virgins
Right.
and concubines. Okay?
Question.
Yeah?
Did the virgins have to move rooms at some point?
Yes.
Okay.
See, after they ceased being virgin, at the
Right.
moment, in the way it worked in this palace
Yeah.
was, the moment you stopped becoming a virgin,
Right.
that's the moment you start becoming a concubine.
Concubine. Okay. Good.
It's a seamless transition.
As I said, this was an epic party.
Right. It was a
Epic party.
seamless transition, and they describe that there were two guys. One guy was Haggai, and the other one was called Shashgaz. And Haggai was in charge of the virgin palace, virgin quarters, and Shashgaz was in charge of the concubine
Were they
quarters.
eunuchs? These guys?
They were called Sarisim,
Huh.
and Saris can either mean attendant or eunuch.
Yeah. Okay. I was just guessing.
My guess would be probably eunuch. If I
Probably
was
not
the
a
king-
job you're applying for,
If
though.
I was the king.
You
No,
wanna do that.
really interesting. We talk about these two different guys. When they dig up the palace, I don't have the pictures here, but they found guard quarters, and each of the two entrances, and two different ones.
Oh, that's
There's
interesting.
two separate entrances to two separate segments, and the Megillah talks about concubine and virgin quarters.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. Now, we even have a picture. They've figured out the front door. That's it. The next one is the front door. That was the front door to the women's quarters, and it was all the way in the back of the palace, behind the king's private quarters in his throne room, which made sense. So that when the women, either there was the front door to their quarters, but if they wanted to go into the palace, they only went into the palace through the king's private quarters,
Right.
which of course, there's a big staircase, which they've again uncovered. I couldn't bring all the pictures here, but it's really fascinating. They have this big staircase. You go up the staircase directly into the king's quarters, which makes perfect sense.
Yep.
Because, where's the king want him? So
Yeah.
so they made this party we know the story. Vashti refused to come. Now the king wanted to show off, and I want to say an interesting thing about this palace. This is really, really interesting. They have dug up a lot of things in this palace. They describe, let's talk a little bit more since we got the pictures. They talk a little bit more about when they took all these women. He said he wanted Vashti to come, and he wanted her to come without any clothes on. He was going to show her off. Now that was a horrible thing for Vashti. She didn't want to be shown off in general.
And you say she was Babylonian, correct?
She was Babylonian.
Right.
Now it's a really interesting thing. You know one thing that they haven't uncovered in all these palaces? It's really interesting. They have not uncovered any pictures of women. It's really interesting. You would think there'd be like these nudes all over the place,
right.
or, pictures of parties with women at them and all that type of stuff. Maybe pornographic images. Nothing. They didn't do that. Obviously, in their place, they didn't do that.
Okay.
Now he wants her to come unclothed. That was totally, totally outrageous.
Right.
Totally outrageous. So much so that there's even suspicion that after he dealt with her, that he realized that he had made a mistake because he was asking like way too much.
Right.
Anyway, once he's done with Vashti, he needs to find a new queen. Well, in the description of how they found the new queen, he said that they would have these women go to the palace, and they would bring them in there, and it says here, they put him in charge of Haggai, that these are the virgins, and he was the guardian of the women with their cosmetics being provided. Okay? And what did they do? They went there for a year. This is the description.
Wow.
They said when the time came, each girl would go to Achashverosh at the end of having had the prescribed time for women, 12 months, for that is the duration of their cosmetic process. 6 months with myrrh oil and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetics.
Wow.
Okay, well, let's take a look at the next thing. They uncovered
Remember there?
they uncovered a statue near the women's palace. And what does it show? There's an attendant standing there with a towel and a perfume jug.
Interesting, yeah. Okay.
Of all things,
Right.
a perfume jug. Here it makes such a big deal. 12 months they had to do perfuming. And look what they uncover. What do people make statues of?
Right, well, what
Then
you're
what's
doing.
going on, right?
Yeah.
Right? And here they make a statue of the perfume jug. Not only that, I don't have a picture of this, but furthermore, when the first guy got there, the first British guy that started excavating,
Right.
he found this like junk heap, like the garbage dump behind
Right.
the palace, and he said it's amazing. He found wheelbarrows full of little jars, and he said they seemed to have been perfume jars.
That's interesting. Amazing, yeah.
All these perfume jars. And here it's talking about how they had to undergo a 1-year cosmetic treatment thing so that when they got to the king, they would smell really good.
Right. Well, what's
Okay.
Okay, right. Makes sense. Makes
So
sense.
here you
yeah.
go. Now, isn't that interesting that listen, none of these things are solid gold proof.
But they're pretty close there, right?
Kind of interesting that they would find this thing of someone with a perfume jar, and then later on they found the perfume jars,
Right.
and they matched, and they could test them, and they found that they were perfume jars, and they matched the perfume jar that this guy's holding with his towel
Interesting.
in the picture.
It's interesting. Yeah,
Right?
There you go.
Okay, now, what else we got? Who was Achashverosh anyway? Let's take a look and see. We've got a picture here of Xerxes, the
Yeah.
king. That is our man Xerxes. Now, was Xerxes Achashverosh? That's a good question. Xerxes doesn't sound so much like Achashverosh. First thing I want you to know, Xerxes is the Greek name that the Greeks gave him. But
Right.
his name in Persian was, let me get his, I'll say I can pronounce it right for you. I don't want to mispronounce the guy's name, but it was something along the lines of, I'm forgetting it right now, what the guy's name was. I want to give it to you exact, so I'm not misrepresenting anything
Right.
here, but I think it was something along the, here we go. There we go. His name was Chasharsha. Achashverosh, okay?
Pretty
Now,
close.
it's not exactly, But we think that that's Xerxes was Chashiarsha.
That's pretty close.
Okay, that was Xerxes. Many historians think that Xerxes was the guy. Now, it's really interesting. When Esther came to Achashverosh, there's this big deal about the fact that when you go into the king, if you're unannounced,
Kill you. Yep.
Right? That's it. You can't come in unannounced. And she was going to go uninvited. She was going to go into the king. And she said, the whole thing will be, wait to see, does he tap me with his scepter or not?
Right.
Does he tap me with his scepter? Okay? Now, he's sitting up on the throne. If he taps you with the scepter, you're okay. If he doesn't,
oops.
Yeah, uninvited?
Bad news.
Last time you ever come uninvited.
Right.
Okay. When they dig up this thing of Xerxes, what's he holding there?
He's got a scepter right
But
there.
look at the scepter. Most kings have this scepter.
It's a long scepter.
Like, he's got a really long one.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of just, most kings like have a scepter with an orb and
Right.
jewels.
And
It's a
keep
big
very
thick
nice
thing.
thing.
But he's got this real long thing. You
Right.
can't even see the whole thing in the picture.
Right.
But it's really long. Right? And every engraving of him, he holds this really long scepter.
Interesting.
Be pretty good if you needed to reach out and tap
somebody,
people.
right.
It'd be long and thin. Because if it was a big, heavy one,
Well, you won't be able to do it.
you can't do it, right? You
Right.
can't reach. And he's up there on the throne. He's real high.
Right.
Everyone's down on the floor. So he's got to be able to reach out. So he's got this long, thin, interestingly enough,
interesting.
this
Very
long, thin scepter. Okay, now, we have, so we got this picture. This is the guy. So we think we know who it was. We think it's the guy that the Greeks called Xerxes. And the Persians called Chashiarsha, okay, and we call Achashverosh. And actually, we could get into a little bit of a discussion because it's really interesting. Cha and Ach, the letter Ches in Hebrew, if it's got a patach under it with the Ah sound, okay, and it comes at the end of a word, we call it Ach, right? So we have him Achashverosh, and they have him Cha. We have Ach, and they have him as Cha. So it's interesting. We could make it work. But anyway, okay. Now, the next thing we've got is we want to take a look at, there's a lion. We've got a lion on the, is that our next screen up? I think we got a lion coming up. There is an outer courtyard. It talks about the fact one night the king couldn't sleep. The king couldn't sleep. After he's invited to the party with Esther, he couldn't sleep. And he thought that maybe someone had done something good for him, and he hadn't rewarded him. And they talk about this outer courtyard. The outer courtyard, there's an inner courtyard and outer courtyard. Now, when they found in the inner courtyard, they went into this beautiful inner courtyard. I just put this up, it's so beautiful. They have on the bricks in the wall is this lion. And they figure that they found it was all broken up, but when they, because the tiles had fallen off the wall,
Right.
but when they reassembled, they saw this beautiful lion, and they realized that the whole room, this courtyard, the walls were made up of these beautiful animals, lions and scenes
Right.
and stuff like that, all engraved. And this is in the outer courtyard. When Achashverosh realizes he hasn't rewarded Haman, he says, he hasn't rewarded Mordechai, he says, who's in the courtyard? Well, Haman was in the courtyard. That courtyard, he probably would have been sitting there on the far wall when he came in the courtyard.
Right.
That's the lion he would have been looking at if he was in that courtyard. Okay, I just thought it was cool,
That's
so I
interesting.
brought that picture up.
I
Okay,
like it.
Now, the next thing we got is he says to Haman, what should we do for someone that we haven't rewarded? So Haman says, you should dress him up in the king's garments and take him on the king's horse. Take him on the king's horse. Okay? Now, there is a engraving there in the wall. And it's got a picture of them leading the king's
I'll move out of the
horse.
way so you can see.
Yeah. Now, right in front of the king's horse is another guy, and he's carrying a stool. If you can look really closely at the stool, you'll notice, by the way, that the legs of the stool match the legs on the throne of Xerxes.
Right.
So they built this stool so that when he went to get on the horse, he'd climb on the horse.
Right.
And of course, they designed the king's stool the same way they designed his
His throne.
his
right.
throne.
Okay.
Right. So now Now, there's a great story in the Megillah, in the tractate Megillah, which is a medrash. It tells us stories behind the story. So it says Haman had to lead Mordechai on the king's horse. So Mordechai got out there, and he got next to the horse, and he said to Haman, "I can't get up on the horse." And Haman didn't have a stool, so he told Haman, "Bend down." And he stood on Haman to climb up on the horse. So you see that when they traveled, you didn't jump up on a nobleman did not jump up on a horse. A nobleman didn't grab the saddle and fling himself up on it like we do nowadays.
Right.
A nobleman had a stool there to get up on. And Mordechai says to Haman, "I got no stool. Where's the stool?"
Right.
So Haman had to be the stool. So you see in this picture that whenever they went with the horse, they carried him. And they all talk about they had these special gray horses that only the king would ride on, and it was a very special thing. So there's a picture of the king and his horse. Now, when they got to the palace, this is a really interesting thing. There's a picture of the palace. There, that's the palace, right? So when they got to the palace, that is a picture. If you were sitting in the king's palace and you were looking out toward the city of Shushan, you wouldn't see it. You wouldn't see it.
No.
There's only one thing you can really see in that picture. There's a little tower. That happens to be the tower that is the top of the tower that is from the shrine to Daniel the prophet, who's supposed to be buried in that town.
Right.
They have a big shrine to Daniel the prophet. The reason why you can't see it is because the city of Shushan is lower down. The palace was built up on a hill, which they turned into a great huge terrace. And there's a whole description. When they were digging up the palace, they found this description written by Darius as to how he actually built it.
Mm-hmm.
And what he filled it was like, I forget how many tons of gravel that he had to fill in to make this thing flat. But this palace was on a hill, and it was higher above the city of Shushan. The city of Shushan was down the hill. When you looked out from the city, from the palace, you could not see the city. You saw right over the top of it.
Okay.
Couldn't see the city. Now, Haman wanted to kill Mordechai.
Mm-hmm.
How do you want to kill him?
Was he going to? Wait, you going to hang him?
You want to hang him,
right? He built up the gallows for him.
He built a real big gallows, and it says how high the gallows? 50 amos. Make 50 amos. 50 amos, maybe 100 feet,
That's big.
maybe 70 feet. That's huge. If you're hanging someone up there, I personally, if I wanted to hang someone, I wouldn't hang him. You know, I know maybe Clint Eastwood would hang him high, but not me, right?
Ooh.
Not me.
We can get sued there too.
Right. There you go. Okay, so I wouldn't hang him that high because I wouldn't see him.
Right.
If you got him up to 100, like,
No one
who's
can
that?
see him. You're right.
It's the bottom of his shoes, maybe. Right? You want to hang him lower where you can see him. Okay, now, from the city of Shushan, which was low, if you're sitting in the palace and you put him on a gallows 50 amos high,
Right.
then he'll be 20 amos above the horizon and where you see him from the palace.
So we'd be. Oh.
Then it would be a perfect view.
Perfect view.
So they went out there, this guy went out there and he measured the height from the city to the palace. And he realized that if someone was hung on a gallows 50 amos high, then someone who was sitting in the palace could see him at that level. Right? And that was what Haman's plan was. I'm going to hang Mordechai, and I'm going to go to the party with Esther tonight, and I'll be able to sit there drinking and enjoying myself at the party, glancing out and seeing in the distance Mordechai hanging from his gallows. So 50 amos high gallows, like you think, like 50 amos, what's that all about? So he could see it. Okay.
That makes sense.
Okay, now last but not least, and wrap up this story, and like I said, get this Yehuda Landy's book, and you'll see all the rest. There's a ton more in this book, fascinating stuff. But last but not least, the story contains 3 or 4 different places where they sent out messengers.
Right.
And it talks about these fast runners, the fast runners, the fast runners. It always keeps talking about they had these fast horses and these fast runners, ha'achashdranim b'nei haram achim, and it describes them all about, and we talk about 3 times how they sent out these runners. Well, one of the interesting things they have found was there was a highway system. It was a Persian highway system, and they've uncovered it. And you are now looking at, this is our last
I'll get out of the
frame.
way a little bit
You are
here.
looking at a piece of Persian highway. And there was a guy named Herodotus. And Herodotus was a Greek historian, and he studied up the Persian Empire because, the Greeks conquered the Persians.
Yep.
So they wrote extensively about the Greek Empire and their conquest. And he wrote about the fact that they had the most amazing road system, and they had the Pony Express.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, the idea for the U.S. Pony Express came from the Persian Pony
I
Express.
didn't know that.
And what they had was, they had 90 stations that a normal person would take them a day to walk from station to station. And on this highway, you could get, in 3 months' time, if you kept walking every day, you could get from Persia to Greece. This is on one of their roads.
Wow.
You could get from Shushan, that's Iran, all the way to Greece in 3 months' time walking on the roads. But they had the fast runners. They could do it in a lot faster time.
Wow, yeah.
They could do it in 2 weeks' time.
With horses, I assume.
With horses.
Right.
With horses. And you could get from Shushan all the way to the farthest end of the empire, the northern end, which was Greece, in 2 weeks' time. That's pretty good.
It's like FedEx
Right?
almost, yeah.
That's almost, right? And now they've uncovered in a number of places, that's one of them, they've uncovered the highway. So they had this paved highway, and these guys could just beat it along this highway. As a matter of fact, they've also uncovered all kinds of documents about these guys. They actually have the message boards that they would carry with the royal messages.
Wow.
And on the back are stamps, because each guy had to stamp,
When he got it.
Then he got it, and then the next guy got it. And when he got there, he had to show the stamp that he came with the stamp thing, and then the guy at the next place would stamp it, and the new runner would take off, and the old runner could then get a meal. But he couldn't get a meal. And by the
I
way,
gotcha.
they couldn't get meal for 2 days. You only get 1 day's meal.
Wow.
That means you have to be back on your horse
Better
on the
be
way
back,
back
yeah.
the next day. They don't want any of these guys hanging
I like that
around.
motivation.
Nobody hanging
The
out.
union would not go for that, I don't
Right.
think, today.
So they have
No.
found these things in different places around the empire. They have found them with the king's seal on it, and it shows exactly how these guys would carry messages and all the different messages. So when they talk about taking the messages to kill the Jews, and then take the
Right.
messages not to kill the Jews, and the Jews can defend themselves, and all that type of stuff, and it keeps talking about they sent out the fast messengers. Well, Persia was known for fast messengers.
Interesting.
So this story, and many, 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 many other details, this story is clearly written by people that had intimate knowledge of what was going on at the time. And we actually have found that there are cuneiform tablets that have Mordecai's name on them, although perhaps Mordecai might have been just a common name. Right? But they have found some different names, different people to refer to, different times in the story. And we have a lot of confidence, especially when we look at these things. We see how this story really happened. And it's so interesting that we have a story, the Purim story, that has such great detail, and it all took place in one specific location. And to have that location for us,
Wow.
that we can excavate and see so many fascinating things that really just support the story over and over and over again, makes us appreciate how this is an amazing turn of events, and really lends us to believe that all the other things in the story are also true,
Right.
including the amazing miracles that Esther the queen was able to save the Jews, and ultimately Darius, which may have been her son, allows the Jews to go back and rebuild the second temple.
Wow. I mean, I like that. Yes, and people who want proof, there's your proof. That's great. And what's the name of the book again?
Purim and the Persian Empire, a historical, archaeological, and geographical perspective, and the author is Yehuda Landy.
Excellent. Good one. All right, well, I hope when they write the book of Jeff, we have this much documentation.
That's
Great.
right. That's
All right,
right.
thanks. Have a great Purim.
Okay.